Next up, we're going to talk about Viewport Beauty, which is of course making the viewport that I'm using, which is our standard main perspective port, which of course we're used to from, we've got obviously our other views here that we've used before, an orthographic top, front and side. But for this one, we're going to talk about the perspective area, which of course we've used for the previous semester quite a lot, because of course it's more natural to us as artists to understand and see that space as we would normally do in the real world. Now, of course it's virtual space, but this time around what we want to talk about is how we make that viewport look a little bit more beautiful than it is by default. So a few things we want to talk about is, of course, Viewport 2.0, which is the standard renderer that's used in the viewport as of a couple of versions of Maya ago. And they've made some steady improvements and upgrades to this as they've gone over the years, some of them significant and some more significant than others. So we're going to take a look at those options and some of the reasons why they're important, and of course why that might be useful to you in your project. So we talked a bit about play blasts before, and how a play blast can be used in order to take what happens in a scene and of course export that as a file. For instance, if I was to play blast this right now, so say I was to choose a different camera, so panels, perspective, and I'll take the corridor camera in this case, which if I scrub along works like this at some point. Okay, I'll just increase these frames to 300, and we'll move this along. And this looks a lot like this. Okay, so nothing exciting. Here we're following our teacher, or Bob, as he walks along the corridor. Nothing fancy, but if I was to play blast this right now, I'll just go and create that. What we get is a semi-decent output, but of course we still see some of the actual in-viewport options that are enabled there anyway. So essentially it recreates a video capture of what happens in that viewport. And the reason that's not such a bad option anymore is because I've used some of the options available in Viewport 2.0 in order to make that look and feel a little bit more beautiful than it normally would. Okay, so before we do anything, it's worth taking a look at what legacy renders did. So if I head over to renderer, I can see 2.0 is the only one available. You might be using a different version of Maya in which you might be able to see legacy viewport and legacy high quality viewport. For a bit of fun, it's worth checking those out just to see how bad the rendering used to be in Viewport 2.0. But anyway, as a few versions ago, Maya started to use and make use of the graphics cards in your machines a little bit more. So if you're using a laptop, it's probably likely to be an onboard graphics card. If it's a very good laptop, you're probably likely to have had a dedicated graphics card. And of course, if you're using a main machine, either one here at the university or of course one at home, the chances are you have a dedicated NVIDIA graphics card or AMD graphics card. And of course, the viewport tries to make use of some of the features available there. So it's a lot less processor intensive than it used to be, but the results are actually really worth it. So we get some really interesting results from it, which look a little bit sharp, and of course there's ways to make that look even sharper. So let's take a look at some of those options available to us. So I'm going to head over to renderer, Viewport 2.0, and I'm going to click the options box and bring that right up over here. And I'll try to position it so we can see those changes as I make them over here. So let's stretch this out. That looks a bit better. So the first on our list worth paying attention to is of course the performance. The light limit is currently set to 8. I'm only using 3 lights in this scene currently, so I don't really need that light limit to go up. Now some of you previously asked about how you increase the light limit, and this is where you would do that. But you don't want to go too insane here, okay? What you definitely don't want to do is make a per light basis, like say for every candle in a scene or every firefly in a forest, because you could end up with hundreds of lights easily, and it will break your scene, it will break your computer, and there's no need for that. What you have to think about is light estimation, so using lights to suggest areas. For example, in this corridor, I have a lot of lights on the roof. In fact, I think there are 10 in total. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12. So, I haven't made 12 lights. I've made one long area light, which is of course set to reference, so I will disable that quickly. So if I select that light, you can see that's just one light that has been stretched along that corridor, and you can see the effect of moving that up and down. But it's a really good way of making a corridor feel lit. And of course I've got another two on the side, so it's not a lot of lights at all, because it would get really crazy. Either way, I'm still within my light limit and my performance is better. If you start to use lots of lights, your performance will go down and your scene will become laggy and it will become frustrating to work with Maya at that point. So you want to be careful. So my next favorite one is maybe a maximum texture resolution. So 1024 is a pretty small texture resolution by standards these days. That's down from the default resolution. I like to keep this low because I like smooth running of everything. Now the default 2048 is probably fine, but again you might be somebody with a very powerful computer in which you might be able to bump this up to something 4096. But do be careful. The higher you go, the harder it is on your computer. So just be careful with clamping your texture resolutions. Next thing is screen space ambient occlusion, which is a really popular feature and it's used in lots of game engines as well. But ambient occlusion is all about these corners. So if we look at where the wall meets the floor, or where the wall meets the wall, or even more particularly where these lockers meet the wall, we can see there is a active real-time shadow being generated, and that's the important part. Ambient occlusion is about the ambience. Well, essentially, it's in the word how the ambient light is occluding certain shadow formation. Okay, so if we try to think of it this way. If you put your hand on your desk in front of you, you will notice anywhere that is, it will naturally form a shadow directly under it, and it can just make things feel and look a little bit more solid. For instance, if I disable ambient occlusion, we'll notice one thing happening. The image gets a little bit flatter, okay? And we actually start to lose that sense of solidity. So it's a really popular feature, especially in models as well, because it can make, well, you think about it this way, polygons are paper thin. Well, they're more than paper thin, they're electron thin, but they can appear a little bit flimsy, and anything we can do to really enhance that's never a bad thing. So you've got a couple of sliders, including the amount of ambient occlusion. For instance, I can put that right up, but that looks kind of hideous, it almost looks buggy. I find a really subtle approach is sometimes the best, so 0.5 or so is good. The radius is obviously how far that shadow spreads, and we can see we can really bump that up, and I think even at that it feels pretty good. It just makes things read and feel a little bit more chunky, a little bit more solid, but again it's starting to look a little bit too much more like real shadow, so I prefer a radius between sort of, I find 7, 8 and 9 generally does me, but I have in the past, you know, I tend to go for even smaller numbers depending. So we'll stick with a radius of 9 for now, and the filter radius is how much you want Maya to try and clean that image up. So the easiest way to see that is if I zoom right in to a corner. This corner over here is probably the best since it's right there. Now we can see there is those 3 shadowed lines. My filter radius, as I go up, we can see we get this strange marking happening. I wonder if I can get even closer. Of course, it will always push that away. But either way, what it's trying to do is clean that shadow up a little bit to look a bit smoother. So again, it's just about giving your image the best chance it has. And of course, we can up the samples as well. So currently I'm using 16. If I put that to 32, it will be smoother again. But I find the difference is so inconsequential, you might as well stick with something small. So the idea being is that I've just got this lovely little feeling of solidity. The more I zoom out, the more I can still read that image. Because of the ambient occlusion, it remains pretty reasonable at all stages because those shadows are helping me understand those shapes a bit better. And I find that really important, especially these days. Okay, so moving on from screen space occlusion, we've got, of course, hardware fog, which I'm going to enable now. 2 seconds just to make sure that I have my options there. So it's not in, you can't enable it inside here. You need to go over to shading, which is in your viewport box, and then you need to enable hardware fog. So mine is enabled, so I just can't see it. So what you want to do is play around with that fog. So if I disable it, we can see what my image looks like without it. So I have a density fog here, which is just giving me this kind of nice misty effect. And you can see if I drop that away, then it cleans the image up a bit. So I have this misty kind of fog shadow here, just in order to give me a sense of mist and airiness. It's kind of making things a little bit more pastel-y. And of course we can change the color and alpha of that. The alpha is of course the transparency of that fog. So if I start pulling that right up, we can see that the fog gets really thick, and that may or may not be what you're looking for. This is an old school that we used to use in a lot of old computer games. If any of you remember the initial days of 3D on PC, PlayStation 1, and even N64, how we hid the fact that we couldn't see into the distance, we simply fogged it up. So it was a great way of creating mystery and distance in a scene without having to generate a lot of polygons. Obviously, they were far less powerful machines. Of course, you can change the color of that fog as well. So depending on the type of scene you're developing, you might want to add some atmospherics. For instance, underwater scenes would use some fog to pretend that there was some sort of caustics there. And you can make the transparency of that based on the alpha, which can be really useful. But the color's a really interesting one because it changes so much. You know, for instance, if this was a really hot, dry day, I'd be tempted to go for that blistering heat, that sort of orange, overcooked feel, dusty and horrible. It's a bit too orange, so I might drop that down a bit and think about using something lighter, something more deserty to bleach the scene with. But that's only one type of fog. Remember, you can use linear fog as well. So the fall off is not generated at camera, it's generated away from it. But this can be a little trickier to use. So if I go for full alpha, that lets us see where that fog is. And you can see that that fog is following my camera in the distance, that big orange blob. That's useful because I can actually see it. So go for something obvious and then edit it. And I might think about where it starts and where it ends. So the start I definitely want near me, but not all the way close, and then it ends further away. And so now I've got a fog that sits on the horizon a little bit, giving me this hazy look in the scene, which is really perfect sometimes. And of course we can change that color to something bluer and colder to really push things away from us. And I can play around with the alpha to sort of determine how much I really want to see that, which can, from the inside, we can make that look like it's further away because we now have much more muted colors. If you think about your color theory, that blue mist is pushing the saturation of the distance away from us, and that really helps create that sense of distance. Especially when we move in and out, we can see how that affects things, which is really useful. Motion blur, you can safely ignore this, but it can be fun if you've got something quick. And essentially it just tries to create an element of motion blur between frames. I find it a little bit useless. So next is anti-aliasing, which is a word I struggle with sometimes, but today I think I learned it. Anti-aliasing is all about making sure the picture is smoother than it first would be without it. Easiest way to see this is I'm going to disable that reference layer. So here we have a bunch of obviously wireframe outlines. I have multi-sampling enabled, so essentially we can see these nice green lines, but if you really look close you can kind of see they're not perfect either, and that's with multi-sampling on. If I disable multi-sampling, we can see that that graininess becomes much more intense because there's nothing protecting it. So remember that all pixels are square, and that underneath all the attempts that we're making here, naturally digital stuff will try to adhere to those square formats and patterns. I don't understand the science myself, but I know this much. Switching multi-sampling on makes them smoother, and the higher your sample count, the smoother that will be. So sample count of 1, it helps, but not a lot. 2, you can see getting there. But if I jump all the way to 16, we're getting really smooth lines. Depending on the quality recording of this video, this is how well you can see that. But essentially my scene looks smoother, certainly, with all that enabled. But also, one of the big problems I'm having is that I can definitely feel a performance hit in my frame rate, and I want to avoid that. So I'm going to drop the sample count to 8. I think that's probably enough for now to get some smoothness in my performance back. And the rest of these attributes you can safely ignore. So we'll move on to the next subject area, but essentially these are good ways to make the Maya scene look more beautiful, okay? Other options in your viewport, remember, that you want to enable can be done from up here. So for instance, shadows, we want those to be switched on. Definitely worth using. Obviously you'll want your lights switched on. If I disable these lights, of course the entire viewport falls apart. And of course if I disable textures, you know, it's very flat. So I want to be able to see my colors as well. Remember, one thing never to enable. Never use the default material option up here. If I click that, it puts everything back to the standard default material, which has its uses, but it's not what we're looking for today. So I'll disable that and go back to this scene. Alright, that'll do for now. I will catch you in the next video. Thanks for listening.